If the policy decision is that this is what we want to do as a country, well, then that's fine. Then that's the democratic government's decision to do that. But I do think that we need to step back and ask ourselves the question, what is the ill that we are trying to cure?
How do we get out of South Africa's current energy crisis? I posed this question to André de Ruyter, CEO of Eskom, in a recent episode of my podcast, Solutions with David Ansara. What follows is a short extract from our longer conversation. If you would like to watch the full discussion with André de Ruyter, that's linked in the description below. Enjoy. Right, so there have been some significant policy changes over the last year, the lifting of the cap on private energy generation up to 100 megawatts. But there seems to be a lot of red tape. The Minerals Council is complaining that it's very difficult to get environmental approvals. The NERSA application process still has to come, you still need to apply through NERSA for a permit. What's the difference between a permit and a license? And also, why cap it at 100 megawatts? If our needs are so great, why not just lift that cap entirely?
The answer to all those questions is that we should, in my view, I agree with you. I don't see the rationale for capping it at 100 megawatts. There is no restriction on building a manufacturing line for widgets. If a private investor wishes to take risk, well, that's up to him. If he can find a site and he can find utilities and train the necessary staff, he can build a factory as large as he wants to. And then he needs to go out and find a market. And I therefore think that the cap of 100 megawatts is pretty arbitrary, and it could be 1,000. I don't particularly care either way. What I care about is the rapid deployment of additional resources. You talk about NERSA. Now, the current NERSA process for registration is pretty much identical to the licensing process. So it does smack a bit of badge engineering to take one process and say we are liberalizing and then replace it with another process under another name, which is pretty identical. Now, we know the presidency, Operation Vulindlela, is seized with the matter. They are very keen to engage in order to persuade NERSA to really demonstrate that these new plants can be brought onto the grid. But I would agree with the Minerals Council that there is significant appetite amongst industry, mining industry in particular, to bring on the new generation capacity that is required to provide security of electricity supply. And if we can get that security, then we have a fighting chance of getting economic growth. At this point in time, it's pretty clear that the lack of electricity supply security is a brake on further economic growth.
So in terms of governance now, André, there have been a lot of problems that you've highlighted on this platform and elsewhere about corruption, malfeasance. Those are well documented. But how much of the governance problems at Eskom are related to BEE requirements in preferential procurement? And there is scope under the Preferential Procurement Act for exemptions. And I know that Eskom has articulated that it would like procurement exceptions. So, I mean, would you think that it would introduce more efficiencies, more transparency if Eskom were to be exempted from these processes?
We have a tendency in South Africa when we design new regulations to add on more and more requirements and initiatives to every bit of legislation and regulation that is designed. And I compare it to a mountaineer who departs on an expedition and he picks through all the available lightweight equipment that he's got, and he's got a good reason for all of them, and they all make sense individually. But eventually he staggers off to conquer a mountain with 45 kilograms of lightweight equipment on his back, and that makes no sense. I think we as a country need to decide what are our priorities, and then we need to decide what is the simplest way to address the most serious challenge that we face today as an economy, which is the supply of electricity. And if we can solve that as quickly and as efficiently as possible, then we should do so. Interposing non-value adding intermediaries in the process of procurement inflates cost. It introduces additional risk in terms of potential corrupt practices, and it also slows down our supply chains. And I therefore think that there's a good case to be made to streamline procurement processes in order to ensure that we can head off this challenge in the most cost-effective way possible. Bear in mind that electricity is one of the key input costs into essentially any economic activity in the country. If you impose additional costs on the electricity industry, for whatever reason, and it may be very well-intentioned and very noble in its intent, that additional cost is baked into your cost of electricity in perpetuity. And what therefore happens is that if you look at, for example, our local content requirements, we have one operating manufacturer of solar panels. And that manufacturer of solar panels enjoys a very strong protection under our trade policy, so that essentially all government procured solar panels have to be bought from this one supplier. Now, what this means in practice is that there's a premium of between 15 and 20% that we have to pay. And there is also a constraint on the available capacity that this manufacturer has. They've got an installed capacity of manufacturing about 300 megawatts of panels per annum. Now, if we need 6,000 gigawatts, or 6,000 megawatts rather, of capacity, then we had better understand that it's going to take us 20 years to meet the requirement, because we want to give preference to one local supplier that employs a couple of hundred people. What is the greater good? The greater good surely is to have the lowest cost electricity available as soon as possible in the most reliable manner to business and industry, so that we can grow this economy and solve challenges of economic growth and poverty.
Yeah, and it seems to me that Eskom in the past has been treated like a social engineering project rather than an electrical engineering project, trying to address transformation objectives, whereas maybe there's been some scope creep there, losing sight of the core objective, which is to provide energy, as you say. But I just wanted to suggest maybe, I mean, if National Treasury is serious about the energy situation and Eskom were to apply it to the office of the Chief Procurement Officer for that exemption, would that be met with understanding and acquiescence on behalf of Treasury?
We've been talking a lot to National Treasury about inefficiencies in procurement introduced by the Public Finance Management Act. Now, the new procurement bill, which seeks to address many of the deficiencies in the PFMA, is mooted to be presented to Parliament imminently. But that has been mooted to be imminent for the past 5 years, as far as I'm told. So one shouldn't perhaps hold one's breath for too long. But it is clear that it's extremely difficult to run a 24/7 industrial enterprise under the constraints of a system that was designed to provide arguably office supplies for government departments. There are fundamental differences in terms of best modern procurement practices. For example, strategic relationships with original equipment manufacturers, the ability to source the lowest prices from low-cost countries in order to ensure that we can get low-cost electricity. All of these policy additions that are laden onto this mountaineer that's trying to scale the mountain, they all add a burden, and they all make you slower, and they make you less efficient and less competitive. And that lack of competitiveness ultimately percolates down to the rest of the economy. And I'm not sure it's always understood. If the policy decision is that this is what we want to do as a country, well, then that's fine. Then that's the democratic government's decision to do that. But I do think that we need to step back and ask ourselves the question, what is the ill that we are trying to cure?
Yeah, and I think that ill fundamentally is a lack of secure energy. Thanks for watching. Let me know your thoughts on this episode down in the comments section. Also, if you would like to watch the full discussion with André de Ruyter, that's linked over here. You can also subscribe to my other channel, that's linked over here. My name is David Ansara. Until next time, take care.